Well, we're here with Dr. Severin Fowles. Going to be. I'm really looking forward to this webinar, this presentation on the biographic revolution in Plains visual culture. I've had a chance to see some of the rock art that I think he'll be talking about, but I'm really thrilled to have a chance to see the bigger picture, to see all the other images that were key in the development of this very particular tradition, this way of using visual culture on the plains. But to start out, just going to give you a little bit of an introduction here from Crow Canyon. We'd like to thank several people for making this possible. First of all,
one thing, tell them.
Oh, yes.
The screen's not sharing on our end over here.
Ah, all right. So I'm just yakking to y'all and you're staring at my head. I can fix that. Give me 2 seconds. Ta-da.
Perfect. We can see you now.
Apologies about that. So I'd like to thank some folks for making this possible. First of all, Dylan Schwint and Taylor Hasbrook. Taylor, who had my back there, has been really pulling a lot of weight for getting these webinars moving and making sure that we stay on task and that everything's working out appropriately. Dylan has been instrumental in getting the tech side of this moving as well. We've received funding from several agencies, including Colorado Humanities, which is a nonprofit. They seek to inspire the exploration and appreciation of Colorado's diverse cultural heritage. We've also received funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we have support from the Region 9 Economic Development District. They seek to provide private and public sector support to enhance economic conditions in southwestern Colorado. Now, by this point, I suspect many of you have been privy to Zoom conferences or webinars already, but if you have not, or even if you just need a refresher, remember, you can move the talking heads. You can move my balding noggin wherever you need to on the screen here. It's especially useful if you're going through a slideshow and you discover you want to see something that's up there. Feel free to go ahead and move those. You can ask questions, and we ask that when you have a question specific to the presentation, either for clarification or a question pertinent to the subject matter, use the little Q&A button. If you take your cursor and go down to the bottom of the webinar, you'll see that there's both chat and a Q&A function. Put your questions about the presentation in the Q&A. If you're just friendly, having a conversation with people, trying to interact that way, the chat function works well for that. But we'll go through the Q&A and we'll take a look at those questions, and we're going to save up those questions until the end of the presentation, and then we'll have a chance to go through some of those. And I'll winnow them down, try to combine a few if it looks like people have looking for clarification on the same point. If you're finding that you're having difficulties, say you get kicked out of the webinar, like your internet stream drops or you can't re-find the link, we are in fact live streaming this on Facebook at Crow Canyon's Facebook page as well. So you have the opportunity to catch us there too. And so you can head over and find that live stream at crowcanyon.org/Facebook. I think also if you just search for Crow Canyon Archaeological Center on Facebook, it's one of the top pages that'll come up. And certainly you can catch us on YouTube as well. It won't be live on YouTube. We'll be posting that probably by the end of this evening or by tomorrow. You'll be able to see this presentation there as well. And certainly go over and like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. I know obviously you must like us a little bit because you're here watching this now, but in fact, showing your support in a digital fashion helps us with a lot of things like unlocking new functionalities on YouTube and Facebook as well. So show your support that way as well. So we're the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center. Many of you are probably familiar with us. If you're not, our mission is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. Now, you can find more information about us at our website. That's www.crowcanyon.org. And in addition, we always like to acknowledge that the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center is located on land that formerly belonged to and is still the ancestral homeland of Pueblo, Ute, Dene, and Paiute people. This is their traditional homelands. We work here, we research here, and we like to acknowledge the fact that that these are people who continue to preserve and protect their cultural traditions, and they're good stewards to this land. The work at Crow Canyon would not be possible without them and without the continued support of Indigenous peoples and descendant communities. We've got some other webinars coming up. For example, I believe on Thursday, January 21st, the Hisatsanam chapter of the Colorado Archaeological Society will be presenting prehistoric use of Florida Mesa near Durango, Colorado. It's going to be with Tosh Maketa. As I understand it, this is going to be some information about the archaeological excavations that occurred over there by the Bridge to Nowhere. If anybody's familiar with that, this was a big roads project. Some really interesting stuff. I think this will be my first crack at seeing what they've actually been finding, and as they've had a chance to look through some of their data and get some results out. And then on Thursday, January 28th, we're going to be seeing Where Are the Pens? Ancestral Pueblo Turkey Husbandry and Management on the Pajarito Plateau. That's going to be with Dr. Kyler Conrad. Both of those are going to be at 4 p.m. If you found us for this webinar, you're going to find these in a similar fashion. They both look like they're going to be very promising. We like to let you know that you can make a difference. This has been an especially tough time for our tribal partners and the Native American groups that we work with, and ways that you can support those communities are listed here on this screen. You can go to the Pueblo Relief Fund. You can contribute to the Hopi Relief Fund and the Navajo and Hopi Families COVID Relief Fund. Now, the assistance, in addition, the official Navajo Nation COVID-19 Relief Fund is also listed there. And this has been really helping out a lot with getting supplies to people who live in remote locations who might not be able to travel as easily. Several of the reservations have been in lockdown conditions for months and months and months and months. And so this is a great way that if you're at a distance and you're looking for a way to help out, here's how you can do it. So we are about to begin. This talk is going to be presented by Dr. Severin Fowles. He's the chair of the American Studies Department and an associate professor of anthropology at Barnard College and Columbia University. He's conducted archaeological research in the northern Rio Grande Valley for 25 years, including a long-term survey of the Rio Grande del Norte National Monument, excavations of a Spanish colonial plaza, and most recently, a study in collaboration with Picaris Pueblo, focused on the history of indigenous settlements, agricultural practices, and place-based ceremonies of the Rio Embudo watershed. He's the author of An Archaeology of Doings, Secularism and the Study of Pueblo Religion, which I know has been a very important volume for many of us archaeologists and anthropologists. And he's also the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Southwestern Archaeology. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Fowles now, and I think we're going to shift screens here and bring up the presentation. Do you have anything you'd like to add, Sev?
Well, I'll add my thanks, but I could just take it over from there if you're done.
Yes, indeed. I'll stop my screen share.
Well, all right. Thanks a lot, Callum. That's lovely to see you. And Taylor, thanks also for setting this up. And Dylan, I didn't get a chance to meet you, but thanks for your work behind the scenes as well. So I'm going to just start sharing my screen straight away and say a few more words of introduction. Righto, it's lovely to be with you all, and thanks for the invitation to speak. I'm on the Upper West Side of New York City right now in Lenape land, and before I dive into the talk this evening, I just wanted to acknowledge that this what I'm going to be sharing with you is the product of research I've conducted collaboratively with a lot of people, but in particular, it builds on a forthcoming article that Lindsay Montgomery and I worked on together. So, she stands behind some of this research as well, and I want to, acknowledge her right from the start. Anyway, the material I'd like to share with you today, I've described here as the biographical revolution in Plains visual culture. One could also talk about it as the Plains Biographic Tradition. Indeed, that's the way it's best known within the literature. And what I mean by the Plains Biographic Tradition, or rather what Jim Kaiser, an important archaeologist of the Northwest Plains who's defined this tradition, means, is effectively a multimedia tradition of image production that's that came to be focused on narrative depictions of the adventures of equestrian warriors, bison hunters, leaders, a tradition that really dominated the visual culture of Plains societies during the 18th and 19th century. To call it biographical is to say that it focuses on those narrative depictions of actual people's historical acts. And I've offered you an example of the biographic tradition in this title slide. This is a watercolor that was created in 1834 by a Swiss artist by the name of Karl Bodmer. He was at the time traveling along with Prince Maximilian of Prussia, who I'll mention again in just a moment. But it's an image of a Piegan or Blackfoot warrior in an elk hide that's been wrapped around him. And as you can see, it's quite clear that that hide had been painted in a variety of symbols, all of which are commemorating or archiving the various feats that this individual had accomplished over the course of his life. So we see, horses that had been successfully raided or stolen, captured. We see individuals, foes who were vanquished, and this sort of thing. And this really speaks to the way in which the biographic tradition wasn't just an artistic tradition, it was a way of life. It wrapped people's bodies in images. I mentioned Prince Maximilian, Prince Alexander Philip Maximilian, really extraordinarily interesting and complicated figure. We could imagine that he really inaugurated the study of the Plains biographic tradition. In the 1830s, Karl Bodmer, as I mentioned, accompanied him on an expedition to the Great Plains. This was after the prince had been involved in the Prussian army and sort of reimagined himself as a naturalist, explorer, and ethnologist. And what you're looking at here is a page from, I believe this is from his 1834 journal. What you're looking at is an image of a painted hide that he had purchased from a Blackfoot warrior and then depicted in his journal. And in the margins of that depiction, you'll see a bunch of text, scratched in there. This is what it says. Illustrated here are the deeds of an outstanding Blackfoot warrior, some of whom we may recognize in each exploit by his long feather cap. In several places, we may discern bullets flying around him. Captured rifles, bows and arrows, scalps taken, and stolen horses are all represented. I think that this is the earliest, formal study of a biographic tradition image dating to the 1830s. Now, there are other images that we could look to fill out this early period of study of this tradition. You're looking here at one of the portraits created quite famously by George Catlin, who was traveling throughout the plains during the same time period. This is, a chief of the Minnikaju tribe. And what's notable here to me is that this was one of a number of portraits that Catlin painted in which we see on the tailored garments of the individual iconography. This isn't just decorative. Once again, these are battle scenes, presumably of the wearer in the throes of engagement with enemies. Here you can see the warrior on his horse. This is archiving, commemorating, announcing to his social community his feats, and by virtue of that, the honors that were due to him. There are lots of ways in which we can see this multimedia tradition expressed. Some of them are now curated in museums. This is a painted hide robe that was, probably produced in the 1860s or 70s. This is a Lakota example. We see a battle in progress. And even on teepees themselves, this kind of imagery was created. Again, you get this sense of a whole way of wrapping your world in images. Some of these teepees were photographed during the late 19th century, and indeed a few of them even have been curated in museums themselves. Now, I imagine most of you are archaeologists, as am I. For us, perhaps the most significant of the manifestations of the biographic tradition is in the medium of rock art. Here you're looking at a rock art image that we would classify within the biographic tradition. This is from the northern extent of the range in southern Alberta. And as you can see, we're looking at an incised warrior who is on a horse, who is reaching out with his lance to spear a pedestrian warrior, effectively counting coup on that warrior. And indeed, it really is the case that the biographic tradition is most robustly present in rock art. There are thousands, probably tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands of images that have been created as part of the rock art, corpus of biographic tradition art. Okay, so this is something that has been studied for quite some time. I mean, it was really propelled by the research of Jim Kaiser in the 70s and 80s. I'll say more about his work in just a moment. But our thought about this tradition, this extraordinary tradition of iconographic production, has evolved over time. We can look, for example, to the early 19th century commentators who discussed this kind of art. And in the 19th century, it was most common to describe it as a kind of indigenous hieroglyphics or picture writing. Here I'm thinking in particular about the monumental work of Garrick Mallory. This was the period of evolutionary theory that was really dominant, of course. And so all of this got folded into a kind of evolutionary primitivism. Something like the biographic tradition was read as a kind of early stepping stone en route towards alphabetic writing. Now we've left that kind of primitivism behind, but the sense that these were images meant to be read and that could be read and narrated still very much informs the way we think about these images. In the 20th century, anthropologists began weighing in a more formal way. These came to be thought of in sociological terms as a means not just of archiving or writing down with pictures the events that had unfolded, but of using that document, that archive that's worn on the body or on the teepee, as a means of building social capital within Plains communities via this very public commemoration of noteworthy accomplishments. So for example, to draw upon a Catlin painting once again, we might imagine a scene such as this one in which a Comanche warrior is reaching out with his lance at an Osage warrior. And indeed, Catlin might have seen exactly this kind of scene. We might imagine this unfolding. And we might also imagine that the Comanche warrior was, in the end, the only one alive who actually saw this event. How do you mobilize this kind of bravery? How do you mobilize the honor that accrued to you by virtue of this act? Well, one way might be to come back and to actually depict it on the body, on the vestments, to have the rest of the community acknowledge it by virtue of viewing your vestments. And by virtue of that, to gain the authority and clout within the community that comes from that. It's like wearing medals or honors that grant authority within the Western tradition. Okay, so in the 20th century, anthropologists foregrounded a sociological interpretation of this kind of imagery. Most recently, in the 21st century, historians have really recontextualized the way we understand this imagery, prompting us to think about it as iconography that accompanied actually a plurality of indigenous imperial projects that had extraordinary reach across the continent during the 18th and 19th centuries. And here I'm thinking in particular of the work of Pekka Hamalainen, his book, The Comanche Empire, which was published in 2008, knocked the socks off of lots of us. That was a really impressive work of revisionist historiography. Hamalainen gave us a bold new vision of the Comanche as a truly imperial, expansionistic force that had mobilized the horse to do all sorts of things across the continent. I share with you an image, another Catlin image entitled Comanche Warriors with White Flag Receiving the Dragoons. This was from the 1830s as well. You get this powerful sense of two imperial forces just, crashing into one another. This is the kind of political project that we now might imagine this iconography as supporting, or at least supporting the leaders within that imperial project. Okay, so there's a lot of ways of thinking about the work that was being done by these images. But I have to say that I'm quite interested, and what I want to speak to you tonight about is the question of the chronological development, the rise and development of the biographic tradition. Now, I've offered 1680 to 1880 as the dates of interest that bound the tradition for me. The latter date is not terribly controversial. The end of this tradition, really can be linked to what we incorrectly refer to as the Indian Wars. Truly, it was the U.S. genocidal war against Indigenous people in the Great Plains in the wake of the Civil War. Those battles, those struggles lasted long beyond 1880, of course, into the 20th century. But the 1870s marked a real dark period that ended the sovereign life on the plains for many groups. So 1880 effectively is the end to the tradition that this visual culture supported for many groups. So that's not terribly controversial. We could say 1900 if we'd like. 1680 is more controversial, in part because the one model that we have of the rise of the biographical tradition that's been offered has been developed by Jim Kaiser and his good colleague Michael Klassen in a book entitled Plains Indian Rock Art, really important text. And it places the origin of this tradition in the late pre-colonial time period in the northern plains. I'm offering 1680 as the date, and for Southwesternists, that date will not be a random one. That was, of course, the Pueblo Revolt, when the Spanish were kicked out of New Mexico by a coalition of primarily Pueblo and Apache peoples. Significantly, it was a time when Spanish horses were effectively liberated and started to circulate in the hands of Plains and Rocky Mountain groups much more vigorously. And by virtue of the dramatic scenes that surrounded that period of time, the Pueblo Revolt period, I'm going to offer an alternative model of the development of the biographic tradition that really is located in the late 17th century and arises in the Southwest, in New Mexico itself. So the question of origins is really where the heart of this talk lies. I want to review the Northern Plains model that Kaiser and Klassen have offered, and then I'm going to spend most of my time talking about what Dr. Montgomery and I are referring to as the Southwestern alternative. Okay, to give you the basics on the Northern Plains model of Kaiser and his colleagues, it unfolded in a series of steps. So I want to walk you through the steps of the development of that tradition. It begins in pre-colonial times, according to the authors, in the Northern Plains area, in another tradition, a prior tradition that's referred to as the ceremonial tradition. And what I've given you on the left-hand side here is an orange blob that maps out the distribution of the ceremonial tradition as defined by Kaiser and Klassen. And in the box there, a classic image of what this sort of imagery looked like. It's incised. It has static figures. They're holding, in some cases, objects that might be interpreted as ceremonial. But it also included things like shields and shield-bearing warriors, again in a static mode, but nevertheless including icons that would be incorporated within the biographic tradition in later centuries. So the idea here is that in pre-colonial times, there was a ceremonial tradition that was widely distributed on the Northern Plains. And then shortly before the Europeans arrived, there was a local in situ artistic shift towards an incorporation of narrative action in this northern zone, again, just prior to the colonial period, such that when the Spanish arrived and then as the French started, circulating in this area as well, the horses and guns started to be incorporated into the iconographic repertoire, and you get scenes like the one that are now in the text box, an image of a Plains warrior. We would imagine this as perhaps a Blackfoot warrior who is holding his lance aloft and striking his victim, counting coup on his victim on the right. Or an image like this one, in which case, an individual seems to have gotten off of it, dismounted from his horse, and approached his enemy and has overcome him and stolen his rifle. Okay, so the idea here is that as this developed in the northern plains, it grew in sophistication and spread to the south into the Texas Panhandle area and even down into northern Mexico, although we have very little knowledge of the rock art distributions down there. It tended towards greater realism by the end of its 19th century period. I'm giving you an example from the Joliet site in the text box now, where you can see much more realistic horses being depicted. And all of this model of a kind of northern origin and a southern expansion, again, I have to acknowledge, was scripted 20 years ago, and Jim has really developed his ideas further in those last 20 years. But nevertheless, this model was really strongly influenced and developed out of the research at Writing on Stone, a very important site, or rather a cluster of sites in southern Alberta. And it makes sense as to why this particular region would have such sway. Writing on Stone is a remarkable archaeological region for rock art, for Plains, the biographic tradition in particular, includes panels like this one. You're looking at incised imagery that's been traced over on the photograph. Clearly, there's a teepee encampment here with a number of folks who are within the safety of these kind of enclosures within the teepee encampment. We see the rifles of those defending the encampment. They're shooting. You can see the bullets coming out. There's a strong narrativity to this. You'd imagine someone who knew how to read this kind of imagery telling you at great length about what happened at this particular battle, including, for example, those little arcing lines at the top. Right up here, if I can use my cursor, which probably represent horse heads and perhaps represent the number of horses that were captured in this altercation. So Writing on Stone is a remarkable area, and it understandably impacted the way we think about the biographic tradition. Now, I work in New Mexico. My center of gravity is somewhat different. And I would humbly suggest that Writing on Stone isn't the only epicenter of the biographic tradition. Indeed, since 2007, I've been working in the Rio Grande Gorge, which is now the center of the Rio Grande del Norte National Monument. And it has been stunning to see the number of plains imagery created in a biographic mode, appearing in this area that stood outside of the distribution that we used to think of in terms of the biographic tradition. So the Red Star is where I work. And I would like to now offer you an alternative account of the origin of the biographic tradition, a Southwestern alternative that is built upon a consideration of a few a few issues that I'd like you to bear in mind. The first thing I'd like you to bear in mind, to consider with me, is that the depiction of biography, of historical events, especially military historical events, has a very, very deep history within the European tradition. We can think of, the tradition of history painting within European artistic circles. That certainly goes back well before the 16th century. We can think about all those medieval tapestries that depict battle scenes in action. Of course, we can think about the iconographic depiction of biblical scenes. The idea of depicting actual historical events is certainly very familiar to Europeans. The second thing that I'd like you to consider with me is that when the colonists came in, they certainly brought horses and guns and things that we already accept were transformative of many Plains societies, Pueblo societies as well. But they brought more than just horses, guns, metal tools, and this sort of thing. They brought culture as well. They brought, in particular, European aesthetics, ways of making images. And I suggest that we really need to be thinking about how Indigenous communities responded to those new aesthetics and took them up for their own practices and purposes. Okay, two more considerations. Third consideration that I ask you to think about with me. There were some remarkably complex entanglements, social and military entanglements between all Indigenous communities in the American West, of course, and the settler presence, but particularly Plains communities and communities hailing from the Rocky Mountains, with the Spanish and then the French, and then later the U.S. Militaries. We need to think about that as a set of social relations in which there were a variety of exchanges, not just of weaponry, but of ideas as well. And then finally, I encourage you to think about all the ways in which we already know that Indigenous communities very creatively and very proactively appropriated and redeployed colonial technologies. Again, I would include here iconographic technologies, in many cases to use against the settlers, who were coming at them. Okay, so let's keep all of this in mind. And let's keep it in mind as we turn to look at a different portion of the biographic traditions range, one formerly considered outside of it, the Rio Grande Gorge. This is what is strongly influencing, Lindsay and my alternative model of the origins of this tradition. The Gorge is a remarkable place. I hope many of you have been to it. It's very, very beautiful. It is a big rift valley, about sort of 800 feet deep, that cuts through the Taos Plateau, runs from just north of Espanola all the way up to the Colorado border. I've been working in this area for 25 years, but I've been intensively recording rock art since 2007. We have a database of over 5,000 panels that we've recorded as part of this project thus far. Big database. If we draw upon a Google Earth image, we can kind of get our bearings. Perhaps one of the most important landmarks on the cultural geography of this region is Taos Pueblo, a very important center, trade center in particular, during the late pre-colonial and colonial era. Just off the map to the south is Pickery's Pueblo. That really should be spotlighted as well as an important trade center. But of course, there weren't just sedentary large villages, as the really crucial work of Sunday Eiselt has demonstrated in her beautiful book, Becoming White Clay. The Apache have a really strong attachment to this area and really were the arbiters of the uplands of the Taos region. And so we think about this as a complicated interethnic region occupied by both Puebloan communities and an Athabascan, more mobile Athabascan bands. Now, I'm interested in Taos Pueblo in part because it was a big trade center and it drew loads of people towards it. It was cosmopolitan. And this, too, really needs to be appreciated. Folks from Apachean bands not only were drawn to Taos Pueblo during trade fairs, but so too were groups like the Comanche and Ute, who during the early colonial period were coming down from their homeland in the north. The Pawnee, the Kiowa were coming in off of the plains. And of course, this little group that we call the Spanish was also during the early colonial period coming to these trade fairs, in some cases, to get access to French guns that they couldn't get from their own crown. Anyway, this was a place that drew people together where there were a great many things exchanged, but also ideas and cultural practices exchanged. I'm especially interested in the Comanche and Ute, who, along with the Shoshone, who I really should have put on this map, they were around as well, comprise the Numic-speaking folks who were visiting this area during the late 17th century and on into the 18th and 19th centuries. Their homeland was to the north, as I've indicated, in the Wyoming, northern Colorado region, and their entry into this Taos area is something that I and my colleagues have thought a great deal about. This is especially true of the 18th century, when they adopted the horse and were moving about in ways that would restrict their access to certain landscapes. It's difficult to get across the gorge on foot. It's especially difficult with horses unless you're going to a few very specific locations. And so we focused our surveys on some of those locations where we are quite confident that horses could have crossed the Rio Grande, which flows down the middle of the Rio Grande Gorge. If we zoom in on, the biggest of these access points, this is the place where the Rio Pueblo, Taos' sacred river, intersects with the Rio Grande, and we've looked quite closely into where horses would have been moving. We found on the ground lodgepole trails, the evidence of those actual trails. But we've also found, as we've surveyed these zones, teepee encampments that I could talk a lot about. We've worked very hard to document these, but they really confirmed that these were major corridors of movement for equestrian, plains-oriented folks. Now, I want to share, some results of our research at one of those sites, a really important one, known as the Vista Verde site. This is, a site that you can visit. It's part of the National Monument. There's a trail that goes right through it. It's named the Vista Verde Trail. This is a remarkable site. It's in a defensible location. There's actually a sometimes lake or playa just off the screen to the north. It's centered on a sage flat where you have to imagine during the 18th century dozens of teepees. We found the teepee rings, some of them even buried, that they would have been erected. I'm more interested in all of those basalt boulders, which you see in the foreground and in the distance. It was on these boulders that hundreds of images were scratched and abraded as part of what I think is some of the earliest imagery from the biographic tradition. This is what some of the the clearest examples I can share with you look like. So you're looking at bison here. Clearly, this is plains-oriented imagery. Snakes scratched onto the local basalt. In this image, you're looking at warriors. They're on their horses. They've got their war bonnets flowing, their lances held erect. Another image from the Vista Verde site, you're looking at teepees that have been abraded. There's a warrior I hope you can make out on his horse just above the larger of the two teepees. Might be harder to make out, but scratched on the right-hand side of this image are a variety of equestrian warriors, diminutive ones, those under attack, as well as a variety of other details. Now, I've shared with you some of the clearest of these images of these panels. They can be hard to see. They were lightly scratched, and this was initially interesting to us. In part, it explains why, with the exception of my colleague Sunday Eisel, effectively all of the archaeologists who worked in this area, really hadn't paid attention to these scratches. We think in terms of Pueblo rock art or archaic rock art, pecked rock art. So, on one hand, we didn't have the eyes to see it at first. But on the other hand, it tells us something else. It became clear right from the beginning, a rock art tradition that didn't develop on hard basalt. It's not well suited to it. It's hard to see. It barely breaks the patina. Indeed, this is a tradition that developed in the sandstone-bearing areas to the north, and iconographically it fits within that tradition, and technologically it does as well. We can imagine this as an incised technology that was developed on sandstone in the north, brought in by these interlopers, these visitors, these folks who were sweeping in during the late 17th and 18th century. It was being awkwardly transferred onto basalt. And so this led us to initially think that perhaps we need to be looking towards the Ute and Comanche as the authors of this. So early on in the project, we consulted with a variety of groups. We consulted with Hickory Apache, with the Ute, the Comanche. We consulted with colleagues at Taos and Taos Pueblos in an effort to understand this plain-style iconography in a Pueblo land. This has been one of the most gratifying experiences I've had in my career. A lot of those conversations were fascinating, and we could talk about those afterwards. But the Comanche Nation, when I reached out to Jimmy Arterberry, the historic preservation officer, immediately recognized themselves and their heritage within this imagery. And that led to a really productive collaboration that continues to this day. What you're looking at here are 24 or so Comanche elders that we hosted at the site to help us think about this imagery. We've hosted Comanche youth groups. It's been really, really inspiring to learn from and to think with so many tribal members. We've learned a lot, as I've said. In this image, I'm sharing with you a picture of Mary Wiaki, a very close friend of mine now. She's Comanche in Santa Clara. She's one of a number of cultural experts who's really assisted us in thinking about this imagery. She's standing in front of and pointing towards a rock art panel that is out at the Vista Verde site. We're getting in a little bit closer here. Mary frequently carries a very large knife with her. She's tough. She's great. Anyway, she's also an archaeologist, so she's careful. But she, in the course of this discussion, pulled out her knife and used it as a kind of pointer to narrate the biographical scene that was scratched and abraded onto this rock surface. This was one of a number of conversations we had around this panel. And emerging from that is a story that could still be read today, maybe not in all of its entirety, but many of its aspects. And I want to share that story to you now, deeply informed also by the observations of Jimmy Arterberry himself. So this is our tracing of that panel, and this is a story about a central warrior, an individual who is depicted quite prominently in the middle of this panel, or rather a warrior who came with an entourage that he represents. The individual was Comanche, and there's lots of reasons why the members of the Comanche Nation saw themselves in this iconography that we could discuss later. Anyway, this is an individual who has a war bonnet. He has a recurved bow. He has a large full body shield, the sorts of things that were used prior to the adoption of the horse. And it's a story of his and his group's altercation with what was identified as a Pueblo group, one Pueblo warrior representing the group in the upper left. The ethnic identity of this individual was observed by virtue of the tunic-style garment. It's a diminutive individual. We suspect that the artist is trying to convey that the individual is not as powerful. Certainly, we assume it's a he, is using a D-shaped bow, a less powerful bow. And so we get an initial sense of an uneven battle that unfolded. Very uneven indeed, because the Comanche warrior and his group had allies with them on this occasion. They had Ute allies. This was how the shield-bearing warrior at the lower right was described to us. We know from a great many Spanish documents that the Comanche and Ute traveled together. They raided together in the Taos region. Many documents the effect of this during the first half of the 18th century. They fell out, had a falling out during the 1740s and 50s. But prior to that, they did indeed travel together frequently. So that seems to be what's indicated here, our consultants thought. So not only are the Comanche in a pretty good position, they've got better weaponry, they've got Ute allies, they also have spiritual allies, we were told. And I have to say, this is something I never would have ever come to this understanding on my own, I must admit. But when looking at this, there was a tangle of lines that had been scratched on the far right that you can see here. Couldn't make head nor tails of them. But Jimmy Arterberry, who was then the typo, immediately recognized those as a sketchy image of a bear. And I was really grateful for his help in acclimating my eyes to see that. He directed me towards another ancestral Comanche rock art site, the Toller site in Wyoming. This is dates to a later time period, probably in the 19th century. But he pointed to, the just over the shoulder of the individual at the Toller site, we see a very clear bear. He said that's exactly the same sort of thing you're looking at here. But interestingly, this is a spirit bear that's been depicted in this purposefully sketchy manner to represent the way a spirit looks in your peripheral vision, just out of view. That's where the powerful beings lie. And aesthetically, that's been brought into this image. Okay, so the Comanche have Ute allies, better weaponry. They have the support, the power of their of spirit helpers, bear. It's not surprising how this battle played out. Indeed, that's been tallied for us on this panel. What you're looking at over by the perhaps Pueblo individual are 7 hatch marks. We might imagine those as representing the 7 folks that they were able to take out on the opposing side. Let's look at what the Comanche had accomplished. Many, many more, 24 or more tally marks there, indicating that there was a clear victor in this valley, and that's been commemorated and celebrated here. In fact, there was another detail I wouldn't have made heads nor tail of that Jimmy really helped me think about. A tangle of lines between the tally and the big shield there. This he shared with us could quite likely represent spent bows. The idea here being that there was an assertion that the Comanche force was so powerful that they wasted a whole bunch of bows in the altercation. And what we're looking at here is effectively a tally of wasted bows from the strength and power of the Comanche group. What I find most fascinating about this panel is that the artist was really explicit in trying to link these biographical or narrative or historical elements to the various agents. And it's to the point of drawing lines from each of these components to the respective agent. So on the left there, we see the little Pueblo individual. A line connects him to the tally. For the main actor here, he has a tally that is connecting him lines connecting him to his tally, but also to the tally of spent bows, to his Ute allies, and to Spirit Bear. This is classic, elements of the biographic tradition as it would emerge. This kind of explicit referencing of narrative elements to particular individuals. Okay, so the Vista Verde site has some extraordinary rock art that actually takes us all through the sequence of what we might imagine as the Comanche and Utes engagement with the new colonial world of New Mexico, the encounter with indigenous Pueblo communities, but also the encounter with Spanish settlers and, importantly, their horses. Here is another image. Once again, we find a very large, dominant, central shield-bearing warrior on the left there. The real action that describes his accomplishments is in the lower right, however. I want to zoom in on a detail there. What I've highlighted for you in red here is a really interesting detail. We're looking at an equestrian figure. It's someone riding a horse. But note that there is a line across the head. That's a hat line, which in plain sign language was a widely known signifier for, white person or European or settler. Moreover, this individual has that hook on the side. I'll accentuate it for you here. The hand on the hip, that was an iconographic signifier of whiteness or of a settler identity. So this is a Spaniard that's been depicted. And significantly, he's under assault by a number of shield-bearing warriors with war bonnets, aloft, the feathers aloft. He's being counted coup on by, a warrior who is striking, presumably that large warrior who was so boldly presented on the left, just in the prior slide. Now, this could have been commemorating one of the earliest encounters with the Spanish, but probably more importantly was the encounter with the Spanish horses. Horses, of course, transformed Comanche society, Ute society, Apache society, the societies of many indigenous communities, throughout the American West. I want to look to another rock art panel that helps us understand the significance of this early moment when they were building up their herds, coming into the Taos area to gather up initially the herds that were liberated during the Pueblo Revolt, but then increasingly to raid from the herds that were in residence at Spanish settlements and Pueblo settlements. Here, two Comanche elders who were working with us are pointing up to a talus ridge at the very top of which is a rock art panel that I want to turn to. Here's the panel at the top of that pyramidal talus ridge, and two of my students are beginning to lay out mylar plastic to trace these very faint scratches. In fact, that whole surface is scratched with imagery, even though you can't make head nor tails of it in this photograph. It's very, very faint. Anyway, here's a detail of that very complex image, a detail of that panel. And here too, a story is being presented to us that we talked a lot about with our consultants. And I want to walk you through this story as well, which commemorates, we might imagine, the successful taking of horses, but also commemorates a kind of historical moment in which the Nunavut-speaking peoples were reorienting their lives around equestrianism. Okay, so this is a story that begins with a blank canvas, as it were. This is the rock surface, as we might imagine it being encountered by the Comanche artist. And prominent on it, you'll see a little hole, a natural hole in the rock that had some abrasions around it, later added. But it's a little hole in the rock that fills with water after a rain. It's a water hole. And let's imagine it iconographically as such. And let's imagine that this panel is commemorating a story of a time when this water hole is being visited by a number of horses. We see the horse hoofs around the water hole, indicating that they've been there to drink. And we're in luck because on this occasion, the horses themselves are present. So we see, 5, 8, 9, if we include this horsehead reference, 9 horses being indicated here, who presumably have just drunk deeply from this water hole, whose bellies are filled with water, and significantly are probably moving pretty slow by virtue of that. These are indeed what a Comanche warrior has come in search of. There he is, slyly off in the upper left, pretending not to be interested in these feral horses who've come to the water hole to drink. But indeed, just watching them was not what he had in mind. This warrior was interested in capturing these feral horses as part of the process of building up the herds. How to do this? Well, he's poised himself well. The horses are slow. As I said, their bellies are filled with water. And we know from documents during the early 19th century that there were particular strategies that Comanche individuals in particular used to capture feral horses. And they've been depicted here on the rock surface itself. One strategy, this was documented actually by Catlin in some of his journals, was to expertly shoot an arrow into just below the shoulder blade on a feral horse in such a way as to not permanently wound, but to stun and immobilize just very briefly the horse such that you could go and, subdue it and effectively, then move towards breaking the horse. So, if you were a good enough shot, you could actually stun the horse and capture it that way. Somewhat more common was a practice of actually riding alongside or even running alongside if the horse is going slow enough, with a rope, with a lasso that you'd throw around the neck of the horse, and you would tighten it, lightly choking the horse until it lost oxygen and was able to be subdued that way. Here we're being told that 3 of these horses at the watering hole had been choked in that way. So 4 horses seem to have been captured, 4 feral horses. And this, in fact, seems to be archived, next to the warrior himself. You see 4 squiggly lines there This is a metonymic way of indicating within the biographic tradition of this area the horse. The squiggly line is the breath of the horse, standing in for the horse itself. In fact, you can even see the horse that the warrior is riding has one of those breath lines coming off of it as well. So it's a commemoration, once again, on rock, of the accomplishments of this warrior or his group. Equestrianism transformed Comanche society. It transformed Comanche aesthetics as well. This powerful sense of movement comes through very, very boldly in an image like this. This is one of my favorite from the Vista Verde site. You're looking at some extraordinary abraded horses with warriors mounted on those horses. We see their war bonnets flowing, their lances held erect, and they seem to be chasing a number of horses that they're about to capture or they're in the process of capturing. So on the right side and in the lower portion of this panel, there are a series of those arced lines that we've already seen before. Each of those is a tally of a horse that has probably been captured during this very successful raid on perhaps a Spanish community or a Pueblo community. It's difficult to say, but surely the artist would have been able to narrate that very effectively. Another panel in which horses figure prominently. This is a really interesting one for me with respect to this larger question of the appropriation, the potential appropriation of Spanish style visual aesthetics. So we're looking at a panel that includes a number of warriors. They're distinguished by different headdresses. One's carrying a full body shield, quite interestingly. Some of these warriors are pedestrian, those in the lower left. So it dates to an early time period when the Comanche weren't fully mounted, but had both pedestrian and equestrian warriors. But the most important detail here for me is that these horses have been depicted armored. We have, about a dozen panels at this site that depict armored horses, which is an extraordinary detail, in part chronologically, because armoring your horse, in this case with hide armor, was something that the Comanche, the Apache, and very few other groups did during a brief window in the early 18th century, when Spanish guns started circulating throughout the plains. When French guns started circulating throughout the plains during the 1740s and 50s. Hide armor didn't work very well on the horses; just slowed them down. They stopped using it. So this suggests an early 18th century date for this panel. But even more important to me is that it gives us a kind of model, a technological model of how Spanish technologies were redeployed, were reinvented by Comanche and other plains communities. They took Spanish armor, made it their own. They took Spanish horses, made it their own. It's this kind of appropriation that I think we need to look at aesthetically as well. Just a few more images. A battle scene in progress where we see teepees, we see an encampment being attacked. These are some of my favorite, these last two that I'd like to share with you. I think there are three more that I'd like to share with you. This really gives you a sense of, the fray itself. It looks like we're in the midst of the action. You're looking at a very sketchy image in which a mounted warrior we see on the left-hand side here. He's actually riding on the neck of his horse. He's holding his shield and aloft his spear, which is going into a group of pedestrian warriors. He's counting coup on them. It's been depicted almost in the way that like a football coach would depict the plays as he's describing what he wants his players to do, with these big scrawling lines that give us a sense of the action itself. Another that does the same kind of work. This is really one of my favorites. You can make out some mounted warriors here. You can also see, I hope, that lines are reaching out to count coup on opponents. And some of those opponents just seem to be exploding into a kind of chaos of lines. The aesthetic here is a powerful one, I think. It's unlike rock art that we're more familiar with in the Southwest. Okay, here's the last image that I want to share with you before I turn to some concluding thoughts about the origins of all of this. This is an image that's probably the latest of the biographic tradition that we've recorded in the Rio Grande Gorge. It's not far from the Vista Verde site. It's an image, has an archaic serpent on it. I'm not going to say more about that, though it's interesting. But it's an image in which we're clearly looking at a bison hunt. There's a beautifully depicted bison there in the lower portion of the slide. He's being speared in the rump by one individual. We see a horse, individual on horseback who's shooting an arrow at the buffalo. We see a tally associated with that individual on the horse, who's also carrying a shield, that should be noted. But I'm most interested in this other figure that we see on the upper left here. Who is this person? Not depicted in the way that Indigenous people were depicted within the biographic tradition. And indeed, there are some details that are quite significant. This is a figure, let us note, who has an archive of bison kills, we'll imagine, that just dwarfs the horse equestrian individual using a bow and arrow. Who is this individual who's killed so many bison? I think it's none other than a buffalo hunter being depicted by an Indigenous artist who during probably almost certainly the 19th century was reflecting on the end of a whole era out there on the plains, who was coming into the Taos region and commemorating, perhaps in darker terms, the end of the era. I'll give you an image on the left of a statue of Jim White, a very famous buffalo hunter, the kind of person who would sit there with his cross sticks, which are depicted in the rock art, and take out hundreds of bison at a time. The kind of thing that was part of the very wasteful use of bison meat, part of the genocide of that species that marked a kind of death knell for Indigenous communities as well. Okay, so there's a lot more to say about the biographic tradition, but in the interest of time, I want to push forward, strongly. And I want to offer a few concluding observations in support of, what I'm referring to as the Southwestern alternative for the origins of the Plains biographic tradition. Let us make a few concluding observations before we, end with, the final statement that I'll offer, the model that I'll offer you. First observation. In the absence of chronometric dating, in an inability to, for example, radiocarbon date most of the imagery on the northern plains or down in the southwest region that I work, in the absence of chronometric dating, our models of the biographic tradition's origins, they really need to be built on careful historical study and contextualization. There's a lot of assumptions that have become naturalized in the literature that really don't have dates attached to them. And so we need to think very carefully about the historical spread of horses, guns, and images throughout this part of the continent. So I want us to remember that. I also want us to observe and to think about how the Southern Plains and indeed northern Mexican rock art really remains understudied. I'm speaking about the biographic tradition rock art here. It remains remarkably understudied, partly because much of it's inaccessible. That whole area in the Texas Panhandle, it's private land. It's not like on the northern plains where there's loads of public land that archaeologists can access. So we just don't have the kind of archaeological archive of imagery to think with. So let's bear that in mind. Now, it's not to say that there's not a lot of imagery that's already been recorded that I think has been actually misidentified. For example, take this image from Chaco Canyon, which does appear in a few minor publications, buried away. It's clearly an equestrian warrior with a shield and a lance and a bison headdress. This is the kind of thing that has been depicted as I share it with you here, as a close-up of one warrior, making it look like quite a static image. Here's what the panel really looks like. This is an image that I took where I've accentuated all of the scratch lines on this panel. This is on the north side of Chaco. This is not just a static individual warrior. And I should say that that original image here had been identified with the Navajo. I really don't think this is a Navajo image at all. I think it comes from a Plains group that was entering into this area. It's a biographic scene depicting in highly narrative fashion a battle that's underway. There's a lot we could say about this, but I think there's a lot of unappreciated biographic tradition rock art right there in the Southwest. It just lies outside of our traditional way of thinking about rock art. Okay, so here's how I'd map out the distribution right now with the big orange blob covering most of the Southwest. I think that there's a lot of biographic tradition rock art that we haven't considered yet. Another concluding observation, this was truly a key contact zone between the Spanish, not just human Spaniards, but also Spanish horses and indigenous communities. The northern Rio Grande in particular was a place where folks were coming to access the horse, to engage in diplomacy of various sorts, to raid. It was a crucible of cultural exchange and innovation. And we here, I think, have a model of how a highly narrative, historically driven artistic tradition could have emerged or been prompted or could have been inspired. And to make that argument, I want to share with you just a couple of images. This is one of the famous Segesser hide painting details, a detail of one of them. This is the Segesser 1 mural. It was created in New Mexico at the behest of a Spaniard, probably almost certainly with native artists. So this was a Spaniard training native artists in European conventions of depiction, probably depicting in this case a battle that took place in which indigenous auxiliaries of a Spanish force were attacking a probably Apachean compound. It was probably produced shortly after the return of the Spanish in 1692 to New Mexico. And let's take a look at what we're seeing here. Created on hide is an image, if we take away the complicated background, a mounted warrior reaching out to count coup, we might say to strike another indigenous pedestrian warrior. We have seen this imagery before, but in this case, it was imagery created by indigenous artists at the behest of a Spanish patron. So here's a tracing of that panel. Let's just compare it with some of the rock art from the Gorge. Over and over and over again, we see mounted warriors reaching out to strike or count coup on vanquished foes. I would argue that the model for this kind of depiction can be easily found in much of the European traditions that were introduced by the Spanish and actually conveyed by virtue of some of this use of indigenous artists. One more mode of transference that I'd like to highlight. This is an extraordinary document that dates to 1786. New Mexican Governor Anza didn't create it, although he wrote the text at the top. But this was a document that he sent, and here I've got the translation for you, as a tally sheet that he sent as a blank document in 1786 to the Comanche Captain General Equeracapa, so that there might be, as he put it, indicated on it by means of lines and signs, the chiefs who might set out on a campaign that the Comanche were undertaking in collaboration with the Spanish by this point, in the expedition under his command against the Apache, who had now become the common enemies of the Spanish and Comanche. You're supposed to indicate the number of men which each detachment was composed of and the successes that they might achieve. And that's indeed what this document offers us, is a tally. This was at the behest of Governor Anza. Tallies with symbols indicating, Apaches killed in one way or Apaches captured in another. These are stylized scapula, actually, that are being used here. Tallies that included horseshoe glyphs that we've already seen in the rock art, but that were used to tally captured horses. All of this was to provide a means of communication between the Spanish and the indigenous, soldiers who they were interacting with, but didn't share a common language. They were using picture writing, as it were, to communicate important military details. It is really not hard to think that some of the tallies that we see in the rock art of the Gorge, the Comanche rock art of the Gorge, I give you one of those images we recorded on the left. It's probably 18th or early 19th century. It's really not hard to imagine that these kind of indigenous tallies emerged out of the kinds of interactions that a variety of indigenous groups had with the Spanish in these military contexts. Okay, so that's an important observation, I hope, for making a case for the Southwestern alternative. Here's the most compelling for me, though. What I've been labeling as a Comanche and Ute tradition, biographic tradition in northern New Mexico, wasn't alone. There were a plurality of biographic traditions that we've been able to identify. And we're in the early days of trying to understand these other traditions. I'm trying to enlist the help of Professor Dr. Eiselt and others. Images that we're affiliating right now with Athabascans, with Apaches folks. This is a pecked tradition. It has different conventions, but it includes battle scenes like the lightly pecked example here, which I share with you in traced form, in which a large shield-bearing warrior is being attacked by a foe. It includes actual battles in which early boat form horses are being, ridden by individuals along with pedestrian auxiliaries, raining arrows down on, on a receiving group. These are all part of the rock art legacy in the Gorge as well. I would regard these as also being strongly influenced in this crucible of cultural exchange that we call the Taos region. This is a striking image. Striking is the right word for it. It's from right next to the Vista Verde site. Here we can see folks leaning into the action, battling foes. These are the kind of traditions that really would become very common in the northern plains. But I think this really predates all of that. This is, I think, 17th century Athabascan imagery in the Gorge. This is a striking one. This is a tally of horses as well as of slain victims, almost certainly. There's a lot of ways of thinking through this. I won't go into the details here, but almost certainly this lightly pecked image was also part of the Athabascan tradition that we've begun to document. Last one, this one bolder, perhaps later. This from a site just south of the Vista Verde site by about 10-15 miles. Here we see a really striking example of a shield-bearing warrior using actually a sword, which the Apache, of course, were known to have used against the Spaniards and others. Another image that very easily reads within the biographic tradition. Here, too, I think this is not Comanche or Ute, but rather yet another of these plains-oriented groups that is developing new aesthetic conventions during this really interesting and complicated and violent time period. Okay, so I think this is almost my last slide. The argument in brief. The Plains Biographic Tradition, I am arguing with my colleague, Lindsay Montgomery. We're becoming convinced that it arose as an indigenous appropriation of European aesthetic traditions, traditions of historical portrayal that were learned and exchanged in military contexts, but then redeployed in this very creative way to suit the new social and political projects of Native communities out there on the plains during the 18th and, sorry for the typo, 19th centuries. That is the argument in brief. And I will end with just a very big thank you to members of the Comanche Nation and other colleagues who've been so essential in helping us think through this research and the interpretations therein. And thank you all for sticking around. I know I've perhaps gone a little bit long. I'll stop sharing now.
Well, that was just fabulous. Thank you so much, Seb. I'm sure that if you could actually see the 192 participants that are out there, they would be giving you a round of applause right now. Yeah, just amazing stuff. And it was, thank you for the one time that you walked me through some of that in person. And it's just fabulous to see where you're taking this. There are several questions coming in. You can probably see some of these in the Q&A, but perhaps I'll just repeat them so that everybody knows which ones we're addressing. And one of the first ones that I think, just to get some nuts and bolts out of the way, is might these images have been a little more obvious 200 or 300 years ago? These scratched and incised images, would they have been more prominent, or have they weathered significantly? What would they, do you have any thoughts on how they might have appeared closer to the time of their creation?
Yeah, thanks for that question.
And that question comes from Mike Adler, by the way.
Hey, Mike. Yeah, it's actually really easy to answer that question because the technique, light scratching, is kind of what most of the graffiti artists deploy out there in the gorge. So we have loads of people's names, like Bob Loves Sally, 1990, scratched in the very same kind of mode out there, and we can actually look at how weathering happens. So, it gets faint pretty quickly. I mean, after a couple of decades, if you're not breaking through the patina, it'll really fade. So these aren't things that were meant to be commemorations that were visible long after the fact. They served a different purpose. At the actual scratching, when you're crushing the surface of the mineral particles on the surface, it's much more visible, especially with the sort of abrading. So you can have a visual image that is striking, on that initial scratching, but their interest wasn't in creating a permanent document. I think they would have known enough to recognize that it would have faded quite quickly. So I think it was more about the performance in the moment, the narration of what they had just accomplished, and the public recognition amongst an audience that would have been saying, yes, that did happen. We're not contesting it. Your status in the group has been raised. You're a person of clout. But yeah, it does weather quickly if you're not breaking the patina. And we know that, again, from dated graffiti.
Mm-hmm. There's several questions that are sort of focused on some of the details of the iconographic style. In particular, people are curious about the depiction of horned headdresses, or the use of horns, or the use of different styles of headdresses. And I believe Sunday Isold had one of those questions that's coming through here specifically. But several people have asked that.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for that question too. Yeah, I've been trying to get a chance to sit down with Sunday and actually go through some of exactly this material. What I didn't share with you is a lot of headdress imagery that we're actively thinking through as part of this kind of collective, which includes not just Lindsay Montgomery, but also, I should say, Daryl Wilkinson and Ben Alberti. We're collectively writing a book on this, on all of the imagery of the gorge right now. There are a lot of mountain spirit dancer headdresses, loads of them, and it's striking how many. So it took us a long time to appreciate that. And so there are real specific Athabascan references that have been used to identify Apache traditions elsewhere in the Southwest. They're there in great numbers, and so we need to get a handle on that. So in terms of headdresses generally, there are some that are quite specific. They're all pecked, and they're really useful in helping us think about probably an early Athabascan time. The Jicarilla don't have the mountain spirit mass dancers any longer, but their ancestors probably did, and they're there in droves. The other headdresses, there are things like the horns, right, which are very common for Athabascan groups, and indeed many of the pecked rock art panels that we're attributing with the Athabascans have horned headdresses. It's also common in the Comanche. It's not an ethnic identifier in that sense for us. It fits into both of those iconographic repertoires. The long flowing war bonnets, paired with the upright, war bonnets, those two have really wide reach. I would love it if we would be able to zoom in and describe, these in more ethnically nuanced terms. We've asked about this. We've talked to, Native colleagues about this. And we haven't been able to get beyond, the generic there. Certainly they easily fit within both Ute and Comanche, styles, that are known. So yeah, I think that there's a lot more work that could be done there. The key, I think, will be creating much larger data sets than we have right now, comparing region to region. That work has not been done. The writing on stone work, the Northern Plains, well documented. We're trying to do something comparable in northern New Mexico so we can begin comparisons, but we need people on the Southern Plains in northern Mexico looking at exactly these issues.
Well, and you bring up a topic that several people have inquired about, which is, are there places that you can see this in the Southwest that have perhaps been under-recognized? And I know you referenced a few of those already in the talk. Like, I was not aware of some of that imagery in Chaco Canyon, for example. But folks have been asking about further south along the Rio Grande Gorge. Is there rock art similar to this biographic tradition in the Pecos area? Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so I'm the kind of researcher who's monogamous, who sort of sticks with my area, and I should spend more time. I should get out more. I should go and sort of spend more time looking in other areas. But Larry Lohendorf has been documenting tons of this material all over New Mexico. He's been publishing that. I think that were he to draw it together for us, we'd see a much wider distribution all of a sudden. So it's not like there aren't people who are documenting that. I think it extends all the way down into Mexico. I'll bet it goes pretty darn close to Mexico City, if you really want my opinion. It's just we're balkanized. There are people on the Southern Plains doing their kind of research, people on the Northern Plains, people in Mexico, people in the Southwest. We're looking for different things. I tell you, and I think it's okay for me to share this. It was a real privilege to be able to, with permission, go with Dr. Aguilar, Woody Aguilar, to look at some of the archaeology on San Ildefonso land at Tuño Mesa. And darned if Woody hadn't found on the top of that mesa an extraordinary biographic panel of a guy in fringed leggings raining down arrows kind of towards San Ildefonso. The imagery is out there. We just need to give it the attention that it deserves. So, and it would really help the argument that New Mexico and the colonial encounter was a big part of this story.
I've got a specific question here that I believe is coming from Jim Kaiser. And
good.
I'll drop the question. I'm not sure I'm going to get the details right. It might be the kind of thing that you say, perhaps we need to hammer this out. Send some emails back and forth, that kind of thing. But he is very curious about the depiction of armor, the differences between armor as depicted on the Northern Plains versus the Southern Plains, particularly in reference to the Segesser hide painting, saying that these, the difference between the very tent-like armor versus different styles. And is there something to that distribution?
Well, Jim's the one to answer that, his own question, I think. He knows more than anyone. So what I can say is that I really should be sharing some of the pecked armor, which has the more trapezoidal form. That's a real significant, connection to, some of the Segesser, imagery. The Comanche imagery looks somewhat different, or what we're identifying as Comanche Ute imagery. Does look like a different style of armor, but I should have included some panels that had the pecked body armor, which again we're trying to affiliate with the Apache. This is not something that I've looked at beyond reading, Jim's work, Mitchell's work, others who've written on this. It would be great just to expand that data set, look at it all together, and really place it in dialogue with. It'd be nice if we had more imagery that's coming out of colonial sources than just the Segesser imagery. I'm not sure of other, colonial examples of armored horses that were depicted. Maybe there are, but it'd be great to expand both databases, colonial and indigenous. Jim, I need to work with you on that. Yeah.
We might have time for just one or two more questions. One just popped up that I'm actually quite curious about, which is we've often thought of the Southwest and the Front Range, the Northern and Central Plains as being this kind of, at least me being from Colorado, I think of it from the West, but we have to remember that there's the French the whole time out there to the east. In what ways might they have also affected this? I mean, you mentioned that the importation of better French guns had a big impact on the armor, like we were just discussing. Are there other ways that French influence in the Southwest might have been felt in the development of this tradition?
Yeah, that's a great point. You and everyone else who was thinking it, I mean, you're smart. It would be, this is part of the tragedy of balkanization of research areas. I've gotten really interested in looking at the colonial, the Spanish colonial records. There's a lot more work that I have to do there. There are other documents to point to where, like, Anza was actually getting, Comanche leaders to draw pictures of battles for him, which I should have mentioned as well, which are fascinating. I really don't know what's coming the other direction in terms of, on one hand, of course, the French are players. I mean, the Spanish were worried about the French. A lot of their interactions with Plains groups, part of the equation was the French presence and holding that back. So geopolitically, they're a big part of this story. Obviously, the question is whether European aesthetics, European modes of image production, might have been entering via the East through the French, and I have not looked at that at all. Partly because it's just out of my research area, and it should be part of my research area. But then again, I'd love if those who work on, the Eastern Plains and into the Mississippi area would help. So yeah, surely in the Eastern Woodlands, there's studies to be done about how European aesthetics, were really sort of taken up and redeployed there too. I think this is something that, really should just be looked at throughout the Americas.
No, absolutely. The work that you've done with this and learning a little bit more about the development of, say, the Comanche Empire through reading Pekka Hämäläinen's work, it's just astounding to me how much we don't think about in Southwest archaeology that dates from roughly 1500 all the way up until 1845 or a little later. This really helps shed so much light on it for me, and I think for all of us who've been watching this presentation too. I mean, go ahead.
Kellen, if I could just add one point, and this is actually speaking specifically to Jim, because I gave another talk that's, that was a private talk or whatnot, and I asked him to be discussant, and we had a great conversation. And I didn't have time in this talk, but, we kind of came to an interesting, kind of synthetic model. And this is, I think, really where we need to be going. It's not that we shouldn't be doing the kind of intensive work in different regions. And I think what we need to recognize is these were highly mobile folks who were cruising all over the place. And so I think the idea that there would be a Northern Plains origin or source is still right, that there are a plurality of sources. And what you've just prompted me to think about is, like, maybe we should be thinking about a sort of, Mississippian source for biographic imagery as well, something that's coming from the French. The idea is not to singularize it, I guess, but to look at the complexity of all of this and the way in which, colonial ideas might have taken root in the Northern Plains and then taken life, in a distinctive way up there. So I just wanted to add that.
Oh, well, thank you. No, that really just summed it up very nicely as well in terms of the larger picture on this. If people are interested in finding out more about this, have you have any publications out yet? You mentioned that there might be a book on the way. Where can people find out more about this from you?
Yeah, there's a bunch of articles. You can get onto my academia page, and they're all there for free, so you can download them. Some of this imagery is in there, some of it isn't. There's one coming out. The article that I referenced, the forthcoming article that Lindsay and I, produced, that is. I'm not sure what the title of the book's going to be. Maybe you know that, Kellen, actually. It's the Southwest Symposium. It's the next proceedings of that. It's coming out in that volume, which may be next year. But that's where we were actually making this argument for, a kind of aesthetic leap from Spanish colonial aesthetic logics into Plains aesthetic logics.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Sev. This has just been highly informative. I can tell from the comments coming through that people have just had their minds blown a little bit, and it's opened up a world that they hadn't really realized in rock art and in the history of the Southwest. So thanks very much. I think that's what we've got for you this evening here from Crow Canyon and from Dr. Sev Fowles. Taylor, is there anything that I should know about how we sign these off at the end?
No, we just want to thank you guys all for coming, and we hope to see you next week at our next webinar on Thursday, the 21st.
Excellent. Well, you heard it right there. Take care, everybody. I hope you all have a good evening. Thank you again, Dr. Fowles.
Thanks, Kellum, again for moderating. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Awesome. Thanks for joining us.